needed one rush fee. That is the sentence I keep returning to, maybe because it is so small it almost sounds embarrassing to repeat. Not a down payment. Not bail. Not one of those dramatic relationship requests people save for the end of a story. Just one government fee, paid fast enough to replace what the washing machine had destroyed. My passport had been in the side pocket of my overnight bag when a bottle of hand lotion cracked open during a train ride home from Baltimore. I came back late, tired and careless, dumped everything into the laundry room, and forgot the passport was still inside. By the next morning, the navy cover had curled at the corners, and the photo page looked like it had survived weather. Normally, that would have been annoying, not catastrophic. But 4 days later, I was supposed to leave for an artist residency in Montreal. 3 weeks. Travel, housing, and a small material stipend already covered. Not glamorous enough to brag about to strangers, but big enough to matter to the version of me that had spent the last 2 years making bowls at a community kiln after office hours and filling out applications at midnight. I had earned that residency the slow way, quietly, on weekends, by saying no to things that were fun, and yes to things that were useful, by carrying ceramic test pieces home on the subway in my lap because I could not afford to lose another one to bad luck, by telling myself that a life can change in increments so small they do not look like change until they finally do. The replacement appointment itself was not the problem. I got one. The problem was the rush processing fee. The stipend deposit had not landed yet, and a client of mine was already 10 days late paying an invoice. I was short by less than $200. Not for long, just long enough to miss the window. Eli and I had lived together for almost 6 years. If you had looked at our apartment from the outside, you would have called us steady. 2 mugs by the sink, shared streaming passwords. His wool coat on the chair I kept asking him not to use as a closet. My packing cubes open on the bed. A grocery list on the fridge, written in both our handwriting because he remembered coffee and I remembered everything else. We were not a couple people worried about. We were a couple people described with phrases like solid and low drama, the kind of couple relatives pointed at during holiday dinners, when they wanted younger cousins to believe adulthood was just a matter of patience and sensible choices. And to be fair, patience and sensible choices had gotten us pretty far. When Eli freelanced through a dry stretch 2 summers ago, I covered the electric bill twice without making him feel watched. When my old car died, he spent 2 Saturdays helping me compare used hatchbacks and talking me down from a financing decision I would have regretted. When his mother needed a temporary place after knee surgery, we turned our living room into a recovery room for 9 days and told each other the loss of privacy was temporary enough to be a funny story later. That is what I thought partnership was. Not an accounting error-free paradise, just a structure where temporary strain moved around without becoming identity. Your bad month did not become your moral failure. My difficult week did not become my private problem if it threatened something important for both of us. At least that was the definition I had been living inside. The morning I asked him for the fee, he was at the kitchen table in his headphones working through invoices. He did bookkeeping for small theater companies and took almost religious comfort in neat columns. There was always some sheet open near him. Revenue, taxes, projected repairs. A freelance budget with color-coded tabs that made my eyes water. I set the damaged passport, the appointment confirmation, and the rush fee printout beside his laptop. Then I sat down across from him and said, as evenly as I could, I need a temporary favor. He slid one ear cup off. What happened? I explained the laundry room disaster. The residency, the delayed invoice, the timing. I told him I would have the money back to him Monday. Maybe Tuesday latest, the second the client payment cleared. Then I said the number. Even now I remember how small the number looked on paper. Not because it was nothing, because it was the kind of amount a 6-year life together should not have been able to carry such emotional weight. Eli did not say no right away. That would have been almost easier. He looked at the printout, then at me, then back at his screen. He pulled the laptop slightly closer and clicked into a workbook. I thought he was moving money around, checking which card had room, maybe calculating what day my repayment would hit. Something practical, something couple-shaped. Instead, he rotated the computer just enough for me to see the screen. There were 2 columns with bold headers. Mutual, personal. At first I smiled, not because it was funny, because I genuinely thought I was missing the joke. He tapped the lower right cell with one finger, and said anything tied to your individual opportunities usually goes under personal. Usually. That word landed before the rest of the sentence did, because usually means this was not improvisation. Usually means the rule had existed before my request arrived. Usually means I had walked into a room where the decision was already waiting for me. I asked, "What do you mean?" He spoke in the calm voice he used when explaining systems, which somehow made everything worse. He said our mutual category was for rent, groceries, household repairs, and shared travel. He said personal covered career-specific expenses, friend plans, gifts, individual health costs below a certain threshold, and growth opportunities that primarily benefited one person. Then he gave a tiny shrug and said, "This would fall there." This, not the residency, not my name, not the trip I had spent a year trying to earn. Just this, a line item, a classification, something that had entered the apartment wearing my face and left the sentence as an administrative category. I said, "I'm asking you to spot me the fee for a couple days." He nodded, like I had repeated a fact already present in the chart. "I know," he said. Then he added the sentence that split the whole morning in half. "I'm just careful about turning personal advancement into shared obligation." There are phrases so polished they arrive already defended. You cannot argue with them immediately because they sound like they came from a well-lit article about boundaries and self-respect, but the longer they sit in the room, the more clearly you can hear what they are hiding. Personal advancement. Shared obligation. No one says those words to somebody they are standing beside in the way I thought he was standing beside me. Not when the ask is temporary. Not when the door is already open and all that remains is whether you help keep it that way. I laughed once, small, confused, and said, "You're being serious." "I'm being consistent," he said. Consistent. That was worse, because no is a moment. Consistent is a worldview. I looked back at the spreadsheet and started noticing rows I had not been invited to notice before. A museum membership under personal. His conference hotel from the fall marked mutual because, as I later realized, we had stayed an extra night together. My glaze shipment from February under personal. The weekend cabin we booked for our anniversary under mutual. My booth fee from the spring craft market under personal. I had not known he was narrating us this way in private. He had been sorting our life into categories more intimate than a diary and more damaging than a fight. Not because the categories were evil. Because they were so revealing. They told me exactly where companionship ended in his mind. I said, "So if something matters to me, but not equally to you, it belongs to me alone." He leaned back and folded his arms. "That's not what I said." It was, of course, exactly what he had said. Just in cleaner packaging. People like to pretend misunderstandings live in the sentence. Often they live in the translation. One person says it in policy language. The other hears the emotional meaning. Then the first person accuses the second of being unfair for hearing correctly. I asked, "What about when you were waiting on that Riverton payment, and I covered your utility bill?" He looked annoyed in the way people do when they are being dragged from principle into memory. "That was different," I said. "How?" He paused. Not long. Just long enough to make the truth visible before he dressed it. "Because the shutoff affected both of us," he said. There it was. The line. If the lights going out would have darkened his side of the apartment too, then my help had qualified as mutual. If a rush fee protected only my name, my application, my future, then even after 6 years it stayed personal. I stared at him for a second longer than was comfortable for either of us. The passport lay between us on the table, warped and soft at the edges, like proof from a less dramatic life than the room had suddenly become. Then I asked the question I almost wish I had not needed to ask. "When you picture our future," I said, "is there an us in it? Or just two people whose overhead happens to overlap?" He exhaled hard. Not guilty. Impatient. "Mara," he said, "that's dramatic. Dramatic. The refuge of people who want the emotional consequence of their logic to be considered a tone problem." He pointed again at the laptop and said, "I just think healthy relationships are clearer when people don't blur personal growth and shared responsibility." Healthy relationships. Another clean phrase. Another sentence that arrived just as wisdom and landed like distance. Until then, I had still been trying to decide whether I felt hurt, embarrassed, or merely surprised. That was the moment surprise left. What remained was clarity, not because he had refused a favor, because he was defending the architecture underneath the refusal. The comments preserved in the Scout notes had apparently split around exactly this point. No one owes anybody money. True enough. But the stronger emotional read was that the relationship had already been defined by the answer, not the fee. The answer, the little philosophy tucked inside it. The idea that my threshold emergency could be evaluated not by what it meant to us, but by whether my future counted as shared terrain. I asked one last time, quieter now, if it were you, and a small delay could cost you something you'd worked years for, would you want me to open a spreadsheet before I answered? He did not answer immediately. That should have told me everything. A person who believes in their own fairness usually has a fast answer ready when roles reverse. Instead, he said, that's not a fair comparison. Which, in relationship language, often means, yes, but I dislike what it reveals. I stood up. Not theatrically. Just because sitting there any longer felt like cooperating with the wrong version of my life. I took the passport and the printout back into my hands. Then I said, I didn't ask because I'm irresponsible. I asked because I thought we were past the point where one temporary problem needed a policy review. He rubbed his forehead. I'm not trying to punish you. I almost smiled. Not because it was sweet. Because people reach for intention when impact has already become too visible to manage. I said, I know. That's the part I'm finally understanding. He frowned. What does that mean? It meant this was not a momentary cruelty. It meant I was not seeing a worst version of him flare up under stress. I was seeing a coherent version of him operate exactly as designed. But I did not have language for all of that yet. So I only said, it means the spreadsheet answered a bigger question than the one I asked. Then I went to the bedroom and shut the door. For 10 minutes I sat on the edge of the bed with my half-packed suitcase open beside me. A sweater rolled beside a converter plug. A notebook I had bought for residency sketches still blank. 2 clay-stained aprons folded into the wrong corner. Life looked so ordinary from that angle that I could almost have convinced myself nothing decisive had happened. But some decisions do not announce themselves with noise. They arrive as alignment. A pattern clicks into place, and suddenly every earlier compromise changes shape. I thought about the time Eli called my Saturday studio hours a hobby phase even after I started selling pieces. I thought about how he described my markets as your little circuit, while expecting me to remember the opening nights of every black box show one of his clients produced. I thought about the fact that when his work expanded, we called it momentum, but when mine did, he called it scheduling. None of those memories had felt criminal when they happened. That is what makes some relationships so hard to leave. They are not built from one unmistakable rupture. They are built from 100 low-grade translations of your importance. By the time the clean-proof object appears, the argument has already been quietly running for years. I texted my friend Naomi. Not the whole story. Just, do you have about 200 I can return Monday? Emergency residency paperwork disaster. She sent back yes before I finished putting the phone down. Then, sending now. Don't lose that opportunity over paperwork. Then, a minute later, tell me what happened when you can. There are moments when generosity embarrasses you because it makes the previous absence impossible to rename. I paid the fee online from the kitchen counter while Eli was in the shower. The confirmation email hit my inbox at 11:42. I stared at it for a full minute, not in triumph, in grief. Because the problem had been solved and nothing important had been repaired. When he came back into the kitchen, the receipt was still open on my screen. He glanced at it and said, "So you figured it out?" Figured it out. As if my disappointment had been logistical. As if the obstacle had been the money itself. As if what hurt was being short, not being sorted. I closed the laptop and said, yes. He nodded once, like the system had worked. Like the apartment had returned to being reasonable. Then he poured coffee and asked whether I wanted lunch later before my appointment downtown. There is a kind of normalcy that feels more insulting than a fight. It assumes the room will accept whatever story the calmer person offers first. I said no. Then I took the subway to the passport office with Naomi's transfer receipt still sitting in my bank notifications like a small, bright accusation. Government offices are useful places to understand your own life because they refuse drama. Everyone is there because paper failed somewhere. Names misspelled. Photos rejected. Birth certificates folded the wrong way through time. No one cares about your revelation. You take a number. You wait. You move forward when called. I sat beneath fluorescent lights and watched people clutch manila folders to their chests. A father trying to keep twin boys from sliding under the rope divider. A woman in a navy suit muttering to herself over missing photocopies. A college student rehearsing an explanation for why his signature did not match. And I kept thinking the strangest part of adulthood is how often your real heartbreak arrives while doing something administrative. By the time my new passport was approved for pickup, I had stopped asking whether Eli was technically wrong. Technicalities are cheap comfort. He had a right to his categories. He had a right to his private definitions. What he did not have was the right to keep benefiting from a relationship built on my warmer interpretation while quietly operating by a colder one. That night, he tried once more. Not with an apology. With management. He said he could tell I was upset and asked if we should revisit the framework after I got back from Montreal. Framework. There it was again. A relationship described like a consulting deck. I asked, "Do you hear how you talk about us?" He looked genuinely confused. That part mattered. Confusion means he had not been hiding from himself. He simply believed his language was neutral because it had always served him. "I'm trying to be practical," he said. Practical. The favorite disguise of people whose priorities only inconvenience other people. I said no. You're trying to act like the problem is the terminology, and not the fact that after 6 years, you still think my future becomes shared only when it flatters yours. That landed. Not because he agreed, because he went quiet. Then he said, "That's unfair." Maybe it was. Maybe it was also the closest sentence to truth we had spoken all day. I did not break up with him that night. Real endings are often less cinematic than outsiders hope. I packed. I set out my pickup slip. I watered the plant near the fire escape. I texted Naomi thank you again. Then I lay beside a man who had not yelled, not cheated, not shattered a plate against the wall, and still somehow made the whole relationship feel smaller than it had that morning. On the train to the airport 2 days later, I opened my notes app and wrote a sentence so I would not lose it in the blur of travel. I thought 6 years meant shared weather. He thought it meant shared groceries. That was the sentence that stayed. Not because it was clever, because it was accurate. We had been sharing surfaces, bills, coffee, furniture, the kind of overlap that photographs well. But underneath, he had preserved a private border around any future that was mine before it was his. Montreal was beautiful in the restrained way some cities are. Gray River. Good bread, studio dust on every windowsill. I worked harder than I had in months and slept better than I had in longer. Distance did something kind for me. Not because it made me miss him, because it made comparison easier. Every day I was there, I noticed how little energy it took not to translate myself into something more reasonable for somebody else. When I came home, the apartment looked exactly the same. His coat on the chair, my mug by the sink. The grocery list now half finished. That was almost the final insult. Evidence that environments can remain unchanged long after meaning leaves them. A week later, I moved my ceramics tools into a small sublet studio Naomi's cousin was giving up in Bushwick. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough to start answering my own life honestly. Eli asked if the studio was temporary. I told him I did not know. That was true for exactly 3 days. Then I did. We ended things on a Wednesday evening, with takeout going cold between us. No screaming. No villain speech. Just a long conversation in which he kept insisting he had only been trying to maintain healthy boundaries, and I kept realizing healthy boundaries are not the same thing as emotionally outsourced partnership. The most useful thing I said all night was also the simplest. I told him, "You're allowed to keep your system. I'm just no longer willing to be loved through it." He cried then, quietly. I do not mention that to make him easier to forgive or harder to blame, only because it is true. People can be sincere and still wrong for you in ways that matter. Sometimes especially then. I paid Naomi back the following Monday. She sent a single thumbs up and a clay pot emoji. No lecture, no invoice, no category. That tiny exchange healed something the argument had exposed. Not because friendship replaced romance, because it reminded me that care often announces itself fastest in the places least obligated to provide it. If I learned anything worth keeping from the spreadsheet, it is this. Watch the system people build around your pain, not the speech they give after. not the neat words they use to defend themselves. The system. The private map, the hidden legend explaining what counts as shared and what gets sent back to you with your own name on it. Some relationships do not end when somebody says no. They end when the reason reveals that you were never standing in the same definition of us to begin with.
Thank you for watching. If this story pulled you in, do me one favor. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so the next one finds you the moment it drops. Remember, nothing is ever just what it seems. See you on the next one.